A wealthy businessman's life changes forever after a tragic car accident leaves him in a coma. While his family and so-called friends plot to take everything from him, the only person truly caring is the hospital's cleaning lady. As he lays unconscious, hearing her voice every day, their worlds begin to intertwine in ways neither of them could have imagined. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Sarah Jenkins walked into St. Mary's Hospital just like she did every morning for the past 5 years. The cleaning cart squeaked as she pushed it down the hallway of the ICU ward. She never imagined that today would be the day her life would change forever. "Morning, Sarah," called out Nancy, the head nurse. "Did you hear? They're bringing in that millionaire who crashed his car this morning, Ethan Thompson. It's all over the news." Sarah nodded, though she barely knew who Ethan Thompson was. She had more important things to worry about, like making sure her son Tommy had enough money for his college applications. Being a single mom working as a cleaning lady wasn't easy, but Sarah took pride in her work and in raising her boy right. The emergency doors burst open. Doctors and nurses rushed in with a stretcher. On it lay a handsome man in what used to be an expensive suit, now torn and bloody. Sarah watched as they wheeled him past her into the trauma room. "Poor guy," whispered Nancy. "They say he was supposed to get married today, to that famous model Olivia Rothschild." Within hours, the hospital turned into a circus. Reporters camped outside, trying to get any news about the billionaire tech genius who had crashed his Ferrari on his wedding day. Photographers snapped pictures of every well-dressed person who came through the doors. Sarah watched it all as she went about her work. She saw the beautiful Olivia Rothschild arrive, crying dramatically for the cameras, but barely staying 5 minutes in Ethan's room. She noticed how Ethan's brother Alexander would show up with lawyers, having whispered conversations in the hallway. Something didn't feel right about any of it. At night, when the circus died down, Sarah went in to clean Ethan's room. The machines beeped steadily, keeping him alive while he lay in a coma. She looked at his face, peaceful despite the bruises and cuts. "You know," she said softly as she wiped down the bedside table, "you sure picked a dramatic way to skip your wedding." She didn't know why she was talking to him. Maybe because he looked so alone. Days turned into weeks. Sarah noticed things that others missed. How Olivia only showed up when photographers were around. How Alexander seemed more interested in the company paperwork than his brother's health. How none of them ever just sat with Ethan and talked to him. So Sarah did. During her breaks, she'd sit in his room and tell him about her day, about Tommy's football games and his college dreams. Sometimes she'd read from books she borrowed from the library. "The doctors say people in comas can hear," she told him one night. "I hope you don't mind the company." 1 month after the accident, Sarah overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. Alexander was talking to Olivia in the hallway. "Everything's going according to plan," he said. "Once we get control of the company, you'll get your share." "Good," Olivia replied. "I can't keep pretending to be the grieving fiancé much longer. These hospital visits are ruining my social life." Sarah's heart pounded. They were stealing Ethan's company while he lay helpless. She had to do something. But what could a cleaning lady do against rich people with expensive lawyers? That night, she held Ethan's hand tighter than usual. "You need to wake up," she whispered. "Your brother and Olivia are up to no good. They're taking everything from you." And then something amazing happened. Ethan's hand twitched in hers. Just a tiny movement, but it was there. Sarah pressed the call button so fast she almost broke it. The doctors said it was just a reflex, but Sarah knew better. She'd felt it. Somewhere inside, Ethan was fighting to come back, and Sarah decided right then that she would fight for him too, even if she didn't know how. Little did she know this was just the beginning of a story that would change both their lives forever. As she left his room that night, she glanced back one last time. "Don't worry, Mr. Thompson," she said softly. "I won't let them get away with this." Outside, the city lights twinkled through the hospital windows. In the ICU, machines kept their steady rhythm, marking time in a room where 2 unlikely people had just started on a path that would lead them places neither could imagine. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new schemes from Alexander and Olivia, but also new hope. Because sometimes the strongest connections grow in the quietest moments, when no one else is watching. Alexander Thompson sat in what used to be his brother's office, admiring the view of Manhattan. He'd always envied Ethan's success, his natural talent for business, but now with Ethan in a coma, everything was falling into place. "Mr. Thompson," his secretary buzzed in, "Michael Davis from Rival Tech is here to see you." Alexander smiled. "Send him in." Michael Davis was Ethan's biggest competitor, a man Ethan had refused to do business with for years. But Alexander had different plans. "I trust you've considered my offer?" Michael asked, settling into the leather chair across from Alexander. "20 million for our new software division?" Alexander pretended to think it over. "It's worth at least twice that." Michael leaned forward. "But you need quick cash, don't you? To keep the board happy while your brother's indisposed." Alexander knew he was being played, but he didn't care. He needed this deal before Ethan woke up, if he ever did. Meanwhile, at St. Mary's Hospital, Sarah was starting her morning routine. She'd begun coming in early just to spend more time in room 507. Today, she brought a newspaper. "Your company's in the news again," she told the still unconscious Ethan as she straightened his blankets. "Your brother's selling off parts of it. I don't know much about business, but that can't be good." She noticed his hand twitch again. It had been happening more often lately. The doctors still said it was just reflexes, but Sarah wasn't so sure. "I did some research on you," she continued, adjusting his pillows. "You built that company from nothing, worked your way through college, started in your garage. Not like these people trying to steal it from you. They were born with silver spoons in their mouths." The door opened, and Sarah quickly stepped back. Olivia swept in, dressed like she was heading to a fashion show rather than visiting her comatose fiancé. "Oh," Olivia wrinkled her nose. "You're the cleaning lady." "Yes, ma'am, just finishing up." "Well, hurry along. The photographer from Style magazine will be here any minute. We're doing a piece on standing by your man." Olivia checked her makeup in a compact mirror. Not that he'd know the difference. Sarah's blood boiled, but she kept quiet. As she left the room, she heard Olivia on the phone. "Alexander?" "Yes, I'm here doing that stupid photo shoot. How much longer do we have to keep this charade up? The board meeting's next week? Perfect, after that we can pull the plug on this whole devoted fiancé act." Sarah's hands shook as she gripped her cleaning cart. They were planning something big, something that would happen at next week's board meeting. But what could she do about it? That afternoon, Sarah was cleaning the hospital lobby when she overheard two men in expensive suits talking. "Alexander's called an emergency board meeting. Says he needs full control of the company to make some crucial decisions." Can he do that? Ethan's power of attorney only covers temporary situations. Well, if Ethan stays in a coma much longer, it won't be temporary, will it? Sarah's mind raced. She might not know business, but she knew right from wrong. She had to find a way to stop them. That night, after her shift, Sarah did something she'd never done before. She went to the hospital's legal office and asked to see Ethan's paperwork. To her surprise, they let her. She was, after all, part of his care team, even if just as his cleaning lady. Reading through the documents, one thing caught her eye. Ethan had updated his power of attorney just 6 months ago. It gave Alexander control only if there was no hope of recovery. But Sarah had proof Ethan was improving. His hand movements, changes in his vital signs when she talked to him. "Looks like your brother made a mistake," she told Ethan that night. He thought nobody would notice these details, but he didn't count on a cleaning lady who cares more about doing what's right than getting rich. Sarah jumped when Ethan's monitors started beeping faster, like he was responding to her words. "That's right," she encouraged him. "Keep fighting. I'm going to find a way to help you, Mr. Thompson, I promise." She had no idea how she'd do it, but Sarah knew she had to try. Tomorrow she would start making calls. To newspapers, to lawyers, to anyone who might listen. She was just a cleaning lady, but she was also the only person who seemed to care about what really happened to Ethan Thompson. As she left that night, she saw Olivia doing another photo shoot in the hospital garden, pretending to wipe away tears for the cameras. Sarah clutched the copy of the power of attorney document in her purse. Sometimes, the smallest people could make the biggest differences. And she was about to prove it. Back in room 507, Ethan lay still as always, but inside his mind things were changing. He could hear more now. Sarah's voice, the beeping monitors, his brother's schemes. Like a man swimming up from the depths of a dark ocean, he was slowly, steadily fighting his way back to consciousness. And when he finally broke through, he would remember everything, especially the kind voice that had been his lifeline in the darkness. Sarah couldn't sleep that night. The board meeting was just 5 days away, and she knew Alexander and Olivia were planning something terrible. Her son Tommy found her at the kitchen table at 3 a.m., surrounded by printouts of news articles about Ethan Thompson's company. "Mom, what are you doing?" Tommy asked, rubbing his eyes. "Don't you have work in 4 hours?" "Just trying to help someone who needs it, honey." She smiled tiredly. "Sometimes doing the right thing means losing a little sleep." Tommy looked at the papers spread across the table. "This is about that rich guy in the coma, isn't it? The one you take care of?" "Mr. Thompson," Sarah corrected him. "And yes, some bad people are trying to steal his company while he can't defend himself." Tommy sat down next to her. "So what are you going to do about it?" It was a good question. What could a cleaning lady do against rich people with expensive lawyers? But then Sarah remembered something her grandmother used to say. The truth doesn't care who tells it, as long as somebody does. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the hospital early. She had a plan, not a very good one maybe, but it was something. First, she needed proof. She was cleaning near the nurse's station when Alexander arrived with his usual team of lawyers. Instead of going straight to Ethan's room, they gathered in the family consultation room. Sarah pushed her cart closer to the door, pretending to mop. "The board meeting is set for Friday," Alexander was saying. "Once we have full control, we can start selling off the company piece by piece. Michael Davis already has buyers lined up." "But what if he wakes up?" one of the lawyers asked. Alexander laughed. "That's why we're keeping him sedated. The doctors think it's for his own good, but really..." Sarah's heart nearly stopped. They were drugging him. That's why he wasn't waking up, despite showing signs of improvement. She waited until they left, then slipped into the consultation room. Sure enough, they'd left papers behind, documents showing the deals Alexander had already set up, ready to sell off Ethan's company for a fraction of what it was worth. Sarah pulled out her phone and took pictures of everything. Her hands were shaking so bad, some of them came out blurry, but most were clear enough to read. That afternoon, she did something brave, or maybe crazy. She went to visit Janet Chen, a reporter from the local newspaper who'd been covering Ethan's story. "I'm nobody important," Sarah told Janet in the coffee shop across from the hospital. "I just cleaned Mr. Thompson's room, but I have something you need to see." She showed Janet the pictures of the documents, told her about the conversation she'd overheard. Janet's eyes got bigger and bigger. "This is explosive," Janet said, "but we'll need more proof, and we'll need to move fast before that board meeting." "I can help," Sarah said. "I hear everything that happens in that hospital. Nobody pays attention to the cleaning lady." Meanwhile, back in room 507, something was changing. The nurses noticed Ethan's brain activity increasing. Sarah had stopped talking to him as much, too busy gathering evidence, and somehow he seemed to miss her voice. That night, she finally had time to sit with him again. "I'm sorry I haven't been around much," she said softly, "but I'm trying to help you. Your brother, he's been keeping you sedated. That's why you can't wake up. But I'm going to fix that." In his mind, Ethan could hear her. He'd been floating in darkness for so long, but her voice was like a light showing him the way back. He tried desperately to move, to speak, to show her he understood. Sarah gasped as his fingers twitched, then curled around her hand. This wasn't just a reflex. He was holding on. "Doctor," she called out, "come quick." But by the time the doctor arrived, Ethan's hand was limp again. The doctor checked his charts and frowned. "That's odd," he said. "His sedation levels are lower than prescribed. Nurse, make sure you're giving him the full dose that his brother authorized." Sarah's mind raced. She had to find a way to prove that Alexander was deliberately keeping Ethan unconscious. But how? The next day, Olivia showed up for another photo shoot. This time, Sarah was ready. She'd borrowed Tommy's phone and set it to record video, hiding it on her cleaning cart. "I can't believe we have to keep this up for 3 more days, Olivia complained to Alexander when she thought they were alone. "After the board meeting, we can stop pretending we care if he lives or dies." "Patience, darling," Alexander smiled coldly. "Once we've sold everything, you'll never have to set foot in this hospital again." Sarah's heart pounded as she retrieved Tommy's phone. The video was perfect, clear evidence of their plot. She sent copies to Janet Chen and on impulse to 3 other news stations. Then she went to the hospital administrator's office. "Sir," she said, her voice shaking but determined, "I need to report something about Ethan Thompson's care. Something very wrong." The administrator looked up from his paperwork, annoyed at being bothered by a cleaning lady. But what Sarah told him made him forget all about her job title. That night, Sarah sat by Ethan's bed again, holding his hand. "Help is coming," she promised him. "Tomorrow everything changes. Just hold on a little longer." And in the darkness of his mind, Ethan squeezed her hand back. He was fighting his way back, one small movement at a time. Tomorrow couldn't come soon enough. The morning of the board meeting arrived with dark clouds hanging over New York City. Sarah hadn't slept all night, worried about what would happen today. She'd done everything she could, sent the evidence to reporters, talked to the hospital administrator, even called the police. Now all she could do was pray it would be enough. At Thompson Technologies headquarters, Alexander straightened his tie and smiled at his reflection. In just a few hours, he'd have complete control of his brother's company. Everything was prepared. The board members were on his side, the papers were ready to sign, and Ethan was safely unconscious in his hospital bed, or so he thought. Back at St. Mary's Hospital, Dr. Roberts was reviewing Ethan's latest test results with a frown. "These sedation levels make no sense," he muttered. "According to his brain activity, he should be waking up, but something's keeping him under." Sarah, pretending to clean nearby, held her breath. She'd switched Ethan's chart with an older one last night, showing how his sedation had steadily increased over the past month. The doctor's frown deepened as he flipped through the pages. "Nurse," he called out, "get me everything we have on Mr. Thompson's medication orders and contact the hospital administrator immediately." Meanwhile, at Thompson Technologies, the board members filed into the conference room. Alexander stood at the head of the table, confident and relaxed. Olivia sat in the corner playing with her phone and looking bored. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alexander began, "as you know, my brother's condition shows no signs of improvement. As his only living relative, I am requesting full and permanent control of the company." The door burst open. Janet Chen walked in, followed by 2 police detectives and a man Alexander had never seen before, the hospital administrator. "I'm afraid we have some concerns about your brother's condition," the administrator said firmly, "and about certain medication orders you've been signing." Alexander's face went pale. "This is a private meeting. Security. Security won't help you," one of the detectives said, holding up a warrant. "We have evidence of medical manipulation and attempted corporate fraud." Olivia jumped to her feet, grabbing her purse. "I had nothing to do with this," she said quickly. "Alexander told me Ethan would never wake up. It was all his idea." The board members started muttering among themselves. Janet Chen was taking pictures with a barely concealed smile. Back at the hospital, Sarah was reading to Ethan like she did every morning, but today was different. The doctors had stopped his unnecessary sedation, and his vital signs were getting stronger by the hour. "Your brother's plan didn't work," she told him softly. "The police are at your company right now. Everyone's going to know the truth." Ethan's fingers twitched in her hand, a familiar movement now, but this time it was stronger. His eyelids fluttered. "Mr. Thompson?" Sarah's heart started racing. "Can you hear me?" At Thompson Technologies, chaos had erupted. Alexander was shouting about his rights while the police read him his charges. Olivia was crying to reporters about how she'd been manipulated and deceived. Board members were calling their lawyers. And then everyone's phone started buzzing at once. "Breaking news," Janet announced, reading from her phone. "Ethan Thompson has regained consciousness at St. Mary's Hospital." Alexander collapsed into a chair, his face ashen. Everything was falling apart. In room 507, doctors and nurses rushed around Ethan's bed. His eyes were open, confused but aware. Sarah stood back, tears running down her face as she watched him squeeze the doctor's hand on command. "Where?" His voice was raspy from months of silence. "Where's the woman who reads to me?" The doctors looked confused, but Sarah stepped forward, her hands shaking. "I'm here, Mr. Thompson." His eyes focused on her face. Though weak, his voice was clear. "I heard you. Every day I heard you." Outside the hospital, reporters were already gathering, having heard the news. Inside, police officers were collecting evidence of Alexander's medication scheme. But in room 507, none of that mattered. "You saved me," Ethan whispered, his hand reaching for Sarah's. "You fought for me when no one else would." Sarah tried to protest, to say she was just doing what was right. But Ethan's next words stopped her cold. "I heard everything. About Alexander, about Olivia, about the company, and about your son Tommy's college dreams." Tears fell freely down Sarah's face now. All those months of talking to him, reading to him, sharing her life with him, he'd been listening, really listening. The doctor cleared his throat. "Mr. Thompson needs rest. We'll need to run some tests." "She stays," Ethan said firmly, his hand still holding Sarah's. "I've been in darkness for months. Her voice was my only light." Outside the room, the world was exploding with news of corporate scandal and medical fraud. Alexander was being led away in handcuffs. Olivia was giving tearful interviews claiming innocence, and the board of Thompson Technologies was in emergency sessions. But in room 507, something else was happening. Something neither Ethan nor Sarah could have predicted when this all began. As she helped him take his first sip of water, their eyes met, and both knew that this wasn't the end of their story. It was just the beginning. The days following Ethan's awakening were a whirlwind of activity. News vans camped outside St. Mary's Hospital, reporters desperate for any update on the billionaire who'd been saved by a cleaning lady. The story was everywhere. Corporate scandal exposed by hospital hero, brother's betrayal thwarted by unlikely angel. Sarah tried to keep her head down and do her job, but it wasn't easy. Everyone wanted to talk to her now. Doctors who'd barely noticed her before, nurses who suddenly remembered her name, even other patients who asked for her autograph. "You don't have to clean anymore," the hospital administrator told her. "With all these reporters wanting interviews, you could make a fortune telling your story." But Sarah just shook her head. "I didn't do it for money," she said simply. "I did it because it was right." In room 507, now guarded by security to keep reporters out, Ethan was growing stronger every day. Physical therapists helped him rebuild his muscles, but he insisted that Sarah be there for every session. "She's my good luck charm," he told them with a smile that made Sarah's heart skip a beat. One afternoon, while helping him with his lunch, Sarah noticed Ethan watching her intently. "Why didn't you ever ask for anything?" he said suddenly. "You knew who I was, how much money I had. You could have asked for anything." Sarah set down the soup spoon. "Mr. Thompson." "Ethan," he corrected her. "After everything, I think you can call me Ethan." "Ethan," she said softly. "Not everyone wants something from you. Some people just care." He reached for her hand, a movement that was getting stronger every day. "Tell me about Tommy," he said, "in real time, not just one-sided conversations while I was asleep." So Sarah told him about her son's dreams of college, of becoming a doctor, how she'd been saving every penny from her cleaning job to help with applications and maybe some tuition. "He's smart," she said proudly, "works so hard, takes extra classes, volunteers at the senior center. He's going to make it somehow." Ethan's eyes sparkled. "I might have some ideas about that." Meanwhile, the outside world was still reeling from the scandal. Alexander Thompson faced criminal charges for medical fraud and attempted corporate theft. His fancy lawyers couldn't help him now, not with the evidence Sarah had gathered. Olivia's attempts to play the victim backfired spectacularly. Old messages surfaced showing she'd been plotting with Alexander from the start. Society magazines that had once featured her devoted bedside vigil now ran stories about her betrayal. One morning, Sarah arrived at work to find Tommy waiting in the hospital lobby. "Mom!" He ran to her, waving a letter. "You're never going to believe this. I just got accepted to pre-med at Columbia University with a full scholarship." Sarah's knees went weak. But you hadn't even applied yet." "The Thompson Foundation called yesterday," Tommy explained excitedly. "They have a new scholarship program for promising medical students. They asked me to apply and fast-tracked everything." Sarah marched straight to room 507. Ethan was sitting up in bed, reading the morning paper with an innocent expression that didn't fool her for a second. "The Thompson Foundation hasn't given scholarships in 10 years, she said, hands on her hips. "Well," Ethan smiled, "almost dying gives you a new perspective on what's important. Like supporting future doctors who have hard-working mothers with hearts of gold." Sarah didn't know whether to laugh or cry. "You can't just—" "I can," he said firmly, "and I will. Not because you helped me, but because your son deserves it. Just like you deserve this." He handed her an envelope. Inside was a job offer, Director of Patient Relations at St. Mary's Hospital, a position created just for her. "The board agreed instantly," Ethan explained. "They need someone who actually cares about patients, not just paperwork. The salary's enough that you won't have to clean rooms anymore." Tears filled Sarah's eyes. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Ethan reached for her hand. "And then say you'll have dinner with me once I'm out of here." Sarah's heart stopped. "Dinner? With you? But I'm just a—" "If you say just a cleaning lady, I'm going to be very upset," Ethan interrupted. "You're the woman who saved my life, my company, and my faith in humanity. You're the voice that led me back from darkness. You're anything but just anything." A nurse poked her head in. "Mr. Thompson, the police are here to take your official statement about your brother's actions." "Tell them to wait," Ethan said, not taking his eyes off Sarah. "I'm in the middle of something more important." Sarah looked at their joined hands, her simple, work-worn fingers wrapped in his stronger grip. 6 months ago, they'd lived in different worlds. Now, "Yes," she said softly. "To the job or to dinner?" "Both." Outside the room, life went on. Reporters still camped out hoping for interviews. Lawyers prepared cases against Alexander and Olivia, and business channels debated the future of Thompson Technologies. But in room 507, Two people who had found each other in the most unlikely way shared a smile that promised new beginnings. Tommy burst in, still clutching his acceptance letter. "Mom, did you hear what the Thompson Foundation did? I'm going to be a doctor." Ethan laughed. "Come here, young man. I think it's time I properly met the son of the woman who changed everything." As she watched them talk, Sarah realized that sometimes the biggest changes in life come when you're just trying to do the right thing. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, she was excited to find out. 2 weeks after waking up, Ethan was finally ready to leave the hospital. The doctors had cleared him, his physical therapy was progressing well, and he was eager to get back to his life. But things weren't as simple as they seemed. "The vultures are waiting outside," Nancy, the head nurse, warned as she helped pack up room 507. "Every reporter in the city wants the first picture of you walking out." Sarah, who had just finished her first week as Director of Patient Relations, peeked through the window blinds. The crowd outside had grown even larger. "Maybe we should wait until dark," she suggested, but Ethan shook his head. "No more hiding," he said firmly. "But I want you by my side when I leave." Sarah's heart fluttered, but she hesitated. "Are you sure? The papers already call me a gold digger. If we walk out together, let them talk." Ethan reached for her hand. "I've spent too many years caring what other people think." But before they could leave, a new visitor arrived. Margaret Thompson, Ethan's mother, who had cut short her European vacation after hearing about Alexander's arrest. "Darling," she swept into the room in a cloud of expensive perfume, air-kissing Ethan's cheeks. Then she saw Sarah and froze. "Oh, the cleaning woman is still here?" "Mother," Ethan's voice was firm, "this is Sarah Jenkins, the woman who saved my life. She's also the new Director of Patient Relations." Margaret's perfectly lined lips tightened. "Yes, I read about her in the papers. Such a heartwarming story. But darling, now that you're better, surely we can find someone more suitable to run hospital relations, someone with the right background." Sarah felt her face burn, but Ethan squeezed her hand. "Sarah stays," he said simply. "In fact, she's having dinner with me tonight." Margaret's face went pale. "Ethan, think of your position. The scandal with Alexander is bad enough without adding this." "This?" Ethan's voice was dangerously quiet. "This is the woman who saved everything while you were too busy shopping in Paris to visit your comatose son." The room fell silent. Margaret's hands shook as she clutched her designer purse. "I see," she said coldly. "Well, don't expect me to stand by and watch you throw everything away. The board members are already nervous after Alexander's betrayal. Dating the help won't inspire confidence." After she stormed out, Sarah tried to pull her hand away. "She's right. I'm causing more problems for you." "No." Ethan turned to face her. "You're the solution, not the problem. The company needs someone with your integrity, your heart. I need someone with your heart." But Margaret's words had struck home. When they finally left the hospital, the reporters shouted questions that made Sarah wince. "Mr. Thompson, is it true you're dating your cleaning lady? Miss Jenkins, how much money did you ask for to expose Alexander's plot? Is this a romantic relationship or just gratitude?" Ethan helped Sarah into his waiting car, ignoring the cameras. "Don't let them get to you," he said softly. "They don't know you like I do." But the challenges were just beginning. At Thompson Technologies, Ethan's return was met with mixed reactions. Some employees were thrilled to have him back. Others, loyal to Alexander, whispered behind his back. Michael Davis, who had almost bought parts of the company during Alexander's scheme, launched a PR campaign painting Ethan as mentally unfit to lead after his coma. "The board needs proof that you're fully recovered," Ethan's lawyers warned him. "And your personal life is under scrutiny. Dating Ms. Jenkins, while admirable, might not inspire investor confidence." That night, at their promised dinner, Sarah could tell something was wrong. They sat in a private room at an expensive restaurant, but Ethan seemed distracted. "We can stop this," she said quietly, "before it gets too complicated. Go back to just being grateful patient and helpful nurse." Ethan's head snapped up. "Is that what you want?" "Of course not," Sarah admitted, "but I'm not worth losing everything you've built." "That's where you're wrong." Ethan reached across the table. "Everything I built left me alone in a hospital room, betrayed by my own brother and fiancé. You're the only real thing in my life right now." Just then, Tommy called Sarah's phone in tears. She had to step outside to take the call. "Mom," he sobbed, "some reporters came to school. They're saying terrible things about you, saying you manipulated Mr. Thompson while he was vulnerable. The other kids, they're being really mean." Sarah's heart broke. Her son's dream of medical school was finally coming true, but at what cost? When she returned to the table, Ethan took one look at her face and knew something was wrong. She told him about Tommy's call. "That's it," he said, pulling out his phone. "I'm calling a press conference for tomorrow. No more hiding, no more letting others control the narrative." "What are you going to do?" His eyes sparkled with determination. "I'm going to tell the world exactly who Sarah Jenkins is and exactly what she means to me. And then I'm going to show them that sometimes the most valuable things in life aren't the ones you can buy." As they left the restaurant, more photographers waited outside, but this time Ethan didn't hurry Sarah to the car. Instead, he pulled her close and kissed her, right there on the sidewalk. Cameras flashed like crazy. Tomorrow, this picture would be everywhere. Sarah's world would never be the same, but as she looked into Ethan's eyes, she realized she didn't want the same old world anyway. Sometimes the biggest risks brought the biggest rewards. "Ready for tomorrow?" he asked softly. Sarah thought of Tommy, of her new job, of the man who had come to mean so much to her. "Ready?" she smiled. "For everything." The morning of the press conference dawned bright and clear. Sarah stood in front of her mirror, smoothing down the new dress Ethan had insisted on buying her. It was simple but elegant, just like he said she was. "You look beautiful, Mum," Tommy said from her doorway. He was wearing his best suit, the one they'd bought for his college interviews. "Are you nervous?" "Terrified," Sarah admitted. "The whole world will be watching." Her phone buzzed. Another call from Margaret Thompson. She'd been calling all morning, leaving messages begging Sarah to be reasonable and think of Ethan's reputation. Sarah let it go to voicemail again. At Thompson Technologies headquarters, the press room was packed. Reporters from every major network jostled for position. In the front row, Margaret Thompson sat with a group of board members, all wearing expressions of concern. Ethan paced in his office, waiting for Sarah to arrive. His assistant knocked on the door. "Sir, Michael Davis is here. He says it's urgent." Ethan's competitor walked in, looking smugger than ever. "One last chance, Thompson. Step down quietly, cite health reasons, and I'll make sure you're well compensated. Better than watching your company's stock price crash when you announce you're dating the help." "Get out," Ethan said quietly. "And if you ever refer to Sarah that way again, I'll bury your company so deep you'll need an archaeologist to find it." Just then, Sarah arrived with Tommy. Ethan's face lit up when he saw her. "You look perfect," he said, taking her hands. "Both of you do. Ready to face the wolves?" Sarah took a deep breath. "As long as we're together." They walked into the press room to an explosion of camera flashes. Margaret half rose from her seat, but Ethan guided Sarah right past her to the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice strong and clear, "you've all been speculating about my relationship with Sarah Jenkins. Today I'm going to tell you the truth." He told the whole story, how Sarah had been the only one to notice Alexander's schemes, how she'd read to him every day, how she'd risked everything to save him and his company. "But that's not why I love her," he said, causing gasps throughout the room. "I love her because while everyone else saw dollar signs, she saw a person who needed help. While others plotted to steal my company, she fought to protect it without wanting anything in return." Margaret stood up. "Ethan, please, think about what you're doing." "I am thinking, Mother. For the first time in my life, I'm thinking clearly." He turned back to the reporters. "Yes, Sarah was my cleaning lady, and she has more integrity, more genuine kindness than anyone else in my so-called social circle. She made me realize what really matters in life." Sarah felt tears in her eyes as Ethan continued. "So yes, we're dating. Yes, I gave her son a scholarship because he earned it. Yes, I made her director of patient relations because she's qualified. And if anyone has a problem with that, they can sell their stock in Thompson Technologies right now. I'd rather run a smaller company with integrity than a huge one built on prejudice and pretense." The room erupted in questions, but before Ethan could answer any of them, the doors burst open. Alexander Thompson was led in by his lawyer. "I want to make a statement," Alexander announced. The room fell silent. Sarah gripped Ethan's hand as Alexander approached the podium. What new scheme was this? But Alexander's face showed something none of them expected: shame. "My brother is right," he said quietly, "about everything. I let greed and jealousy poison me. I conspired with Olivia and Michael Davis to steal the company while keeping Ethan sedated. And the only person who saw through it all was Sarah Jenkins." Margaret collapsed back into her chair, face white with shock. "I've made a deal with the prosecutors," Alexander continued. "I'm pleading guilty to all charges, and I want to publicly apologize to my brother And to Ms. Jenkins, "You saw what our whole family missed. That character matters more than class." The press room exploded again. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, but Sarah barely noticed. She was looking at Ethan, who had tears in his eyes as he watched his brother being led away. "Are you okay?" she whispered. "Better than okay," he smiled. "You taught me something too, that forgiveness is stronger than revenge." That's when Tommy stepped forward. "Mr. Thompson, can I say something?" Ethan nodded, helping the nervous teenager to the podium. "My mum taught me that doing the right thing isn't always easy, but it's always worth it," Tommy said clearly into the microphones. She could have sold this story to the papers for a lot of money. She could have asked Mr. Thompson for rewards, but she didn't, because that's not who she is. And if people want to judge her for being a cleaning lady, well, they're the ones who need to clean up their act. The room was silent for a moment, then burst into applause. Even some of the board members were nodding approvingly. Later that night, after the media frenzy had died down, Sarah, Ethan, and Tommy sat in their old apartment, eating pizza. "So what happens now?" Tommy asked. Ethan smiled, pulling Sarah close. Now we build something new, something better, together." Sarah looked around her small living room, at her son's college acceptance letter on the fridge, at Ethan's suit jacket thrown over her worn couch, at the pile of newspapers with their story splashed across the front pages. "Together," she repeated softly. "I like the sound of that." Outside, reporters still camped on the sidewalk. Margaret Thompson was probably planning her next move, and tomorrow would bring new challenges. But for now, in this moment, everything was perfect. Sometimes the best fairy tales aren't about princesses in castles. Sometimes they're about cleaning ladies with golden hearts who remind powerful men what really matters in life. The annual Thompson Charity Gala was the biggest social event of the season, and this year everyone had only one question. Would Ethan Thompson really bring his former cleaning lady as his date? Sarah stood in front of the full-length mirror in her new apartment, hardly recognizing herself. The red designer gown Ethan had bought her fit perfectly, but she felt like she was wearing a costume. "You look like a movie star, Mom," Tommy said, adjusting his bow tie. Ethan had insisted Tommy come too. "My future stepson should be there," he'd said, making both Sarah and Tommy blush. "I don't know if I can do this," Sarah whispered. "These people, they're not like us." "That's exactly why they need you," came Ethan's voice from the doorway. He looked handsome in his tuxedo, but what made Sarah's heart skip was the way he looked at her, like she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. But Margaret Thompson had other plans for the evening. She'd spent weeks carefully orchestrating tonight, inviting all the right people, making all the right arrangements. If Sarah Jenkins thought she could just walk into their world, she was in for a surprise. The ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was decorated like something out of a fairy tale. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, string musicians played softly, and New York's elite mingled in their finest clothes. When Sarah walked in on Ethan's arm, with Tommy beside them, the room went quiet. Then the whispers started. "Can you believe he brought her? I heard she blackmailed him. Look at her trying to fit in." Margaret swooped in, air-kissing Ethan's cheeks. "Darling, you remember Victoria Sinclair from the Symphony Board? She's just divorced, poor thing, and so eager to catch up." Victoria was gorgeous, cultured, and exactly the kind of woman Margaret wanted for her son. She latched onto Ethan's arm, practically pushing Sarah aside. "Ethan, you must see the new art installation," Victoria purred. "It's just in the next room." Sarah felt lost and alone in the crowd. Even Tommy had been whisked away by some well-meaning society ladies cooing over "that scholarship boy." Then she overheard two women talking behind a potted palm. "Margaret's plan is brilliant," one whispered. "She invited all of Ethan's ex-girlfriends. Once he remembers what real class looks like, he'll forget all about this charity case." Sarah's cheeks burned. She headed for the ladies' room, fighting back tears. But inside she found an unexpected ally. Lauren Chen, Janet's mother, and one of the city's most respected philanthropists, was fixing her makeup. "Don't let them see you cry, dear," Lauren said kindly. "That's what they want." "I don't belong here," Sarah admitted. "Neither did I, 30 years ago," Lauren smiled. "I was a waitress when I met my husband. The society ladies were just as cruel then. But I learned something important. They only have the power you give them." Meanwhile, in the ballroom, Margaret's plan seemed to be working. Victoria had monopolized Ethan's attention, while other ex-girlfriends circled like perfectly groomed sharks. But Ethan wasn't thinking about any of them. His eyes scanned the room, looking for Sarah. When he couldn't find her, he interrupted Victoria mid-sentence. "Excuse me," he said firmly. "I need to find my girlfriend." "But darling," Margaret protested. Victoria was just about to discuss her charity work. "Mother," Ethan's voice was steel. "I know what you're doing. It stops now." He found Sarah coming out of the ladies' room with Lauren Chen. The sight of her still took his breath away. "There you are," he smiled, taking her hand. "Ready to scandalize the blue bloods?" Sarah looked uncertain. "Ethan, maybe your mother's right. Maybe you need someone who knows this world." "This world?" He gestured at the glittering crowd. "It's all fake, Sarah. Every smile, every compliment, every $1,000 dress. It's all a game. You're the only real thing here." Lauren Chen cleared her throat. "If I might make a suggestion, the annual donor speech is coming up. Traditionally, the Thompson family announces their charitable focus for the year." Ethan's eyes lit up. "Sarah, you run patient relations at St. Mary's. You see what really needs fixing in healthcare. What would you do with unlimited charitable funds?" For the first time that night, Sarah felt on solid ground. She knew exactly what the hospital needed. Not more fancy equipment or luxury suites, but programs to help regular people. When Ethan took the stage for his speech, he shocked everyone by calling Sarah up to join him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "the Thompson Foundation is taking a new direction. My girlfriend, Sarah Jenkins, has shown me what real charitable work looks like." Sarah's voice shook at first as she described her plans. Programs to help families of long-term patients, scholarships for nursing students, support for hospital staff. But as she spoke, the room fell silent. This wasn't charity as a social game. This was someone who really understood what people needed. In the back of the room, Margaret watched in dismay as the crowd began to nod approvingly. Even Victoria Sinclair was taking notes. Tommy, who had escaped his society admirers, beamed with pride. "That's my mom," he told anyone who would listen. After the speech, Lauren Chen brought over a group of serious-looking people. "Ms. Jenkins, I'd love to have you join our hospital oversight committee," she said. "We need someone with your practical experience." The society ladies who had been whispering about Sarah now rushed to congratulate her. But she saw through their fake smiles. Just like Ethan had said, it was all a game. Later that night, as they drove home, Sarah kicked off her uncomfortable heels with a sigh of relief. "I'm never going to be good at their games," she admitted. "Good," Ethan pulled her close. "Because I love you exactly as you are." Tommy made gagging noises from the back seat, but he was smiling. They didn't notice the car following them home, or Margaret Thompson inside it, making a phone call. "Yes, find out everything about her past," she whispered. "Everyone has secrets, and when we find Sarah Jenkins's secrets, my son will finally see reason." But for now, Sarah was happy. She might not have won over all of high society, but she'd stayed true to herself, and in the end, that was worth more than all the crystal chandeliers in New York. Margaret Thompson sat in her private study, surrounded by papers. The private investigator she'd hired had finally delivered his report on Sarah Jenkins' past. As she read through it, a cold smile spread across her face. "Got you," she whispered. Meanwhile, Sarah was having the best morning of her life. The hospital board had just approved all her new charitable programs. Ethan had surprised her by showing up to the meeting, and the way he looked at her when she presented her ideas made her heart soar. "You were amazing," he told her as they walked through the hospital corridors. "You're changing lives, Sarah." A group of nurses waved as they passed. The hospital staff had finally stopped treating Sarah like she was an outsider playing dress-up. She was one of them, just with a bigger office now. "Ms. Jenkins," called out Nancy, the head nurse, "Channel 7 wants to do a story on our new family support program. They're calling you the Angel of St. Mary's." Sarah blushed. She still wasn't used to all the attention, but before she could respond, she saw Margaret Thompson walking toward them with a thick folder under her arm. "We need to talk," Margaret said coldly. "Privately." Ethan stepped forward. "Anything you have to say to Sarah, you can say to me." "Really?" Margaret's smile was cruel. "Then let's all have a little chat about Sarah's time in Phoenix." Sarah felt her world stop spinning. No, it couldn't be about that. Nobody knew about Phoenix. They went to Sarah's office, closing the door on curious stares. Margaret laid the folder on the desk. 15 years ago, she began, a Sarah Jenkins worked at Phoenix General Hospital. There was an incident involving missing prescription drugs. Care to explain? Ethan looked at Sarah, whose face had gone white. "What is she talking about?" Sarah's hands shook. It wasn't what it looked like. They never proved anything. "Because you left town before they could," Margaret said triumphantly. "Running away looks a lot like guilt, doesn't it?" "Sarah," Ethan's voice was quiet. What happened in Phoenix? Sarah sank into her chair. The secret she'd kept for 15 years was finally coming out. Tommy was sick, she whispered. Really sick. We had no insurance, no money for his medicine. I was cleaning at the hospital, and one night, I saw where they kept the expired medications they were going to throw away. Tears rolled down her cheeks. I took some, not to sell, just to help my baby. But they found out. I ran before they could arrest me. We came to New York to start over. Margaret looked smug. A thief, working in a hospital. I wonder what the board would think. Stop. Ethan's voice was like thunder. But he wasn't looking at Sarah. He was glaring at his mother. You really want to talk about theft after what Alexander did? That was different. He was protecting our family name. No, Ethan said quietly. Sarah was protecting her child. Alexander was protecting his greed. He turned to Sarah, his eyes soft. Why didn't you tell me? I was ashamed. She wiped her eyes. And scared. I've spent 15 years trying to make up for it, trying to be better. Well, it doesn't matter now. Margaret pulled out her phone. I'm calling the board. They should know what kind of person they've put in charge of. If you make that call, Ethan interrupted, I'll tell them about the Matthews Fund. Margaret froze. You wouldn't dare. Try me. I know you've been skimming from the Foundation's Children's Fund for years. That's why you fought so hard against Sarah's audit of the charitable programs. Sarah looked between them, confused, but Margaret's face told her it was true. You self-righteous hypocrite, Ethan continued. Sarah took expired medicine to save her dying child. You stole money meant for sick kids to buy jewelry. Margaret sank into a chair, her armor finally cracking. Ethan, please, I'm your mother. Yes, you are, and I love you, but if you ever try to hurt Sarah again, I'll forget that fact. He turned to Sarah. Come on, we're leaving. But what about Phoenix? Sarah asked quietly. The statute of limitations on petty theft is long past, he smiled, and I happen to know the current administrator of Phoenix General. Let me make some calls, clear this up officially. As they left the office, Margaret called out, You're choosing her over your own mother? No, Ethan replied. I'm choosing love over hate, honesty over schemes, the future over the past. He looked at Sarah, and I've never been more sure of a choice in my life. In the hallway, Sarah tried to apologize, but Ethan stopped her with a kiss. You were young, desperate, and trying to save your son, he said. I'm not angry. I'm in awe of how strong you were. Tommy found them there, rushing up with excitement. Mom, the Scholarship Foundation wants me to speak at their fundraiser. They say I'm an inspiration. Sarah hugged her son, tears in her eyes. That scared young mother in Phoenix seemed like a lifetime ago. She'd spent 15 years trying to make up for one desperate act, and somehow that path had led her here, to love, to redemption, to a chance to help other parents who were just as desperate. You know what this means? Ethan said later as they walked in the hospital garden. No more secrets between us, no more hiding. No more secrets, Sarah agreed. Just truth. But up in her study, Margaret Thompson wasn't finished. The Phoenix story hadn't worked, but she had one more card to play. She picked up her phone. Hello, yes, I need to speak to Robert Jenkins. Yes, Sarah's ex-husband. I think he'd be very interested in what's happening in New York. The autumn wind scattered leaves across the garden, where Sarah and Ethan walked, happy in their truth, unaware that the biggest storm was yet to come. The day of Tommy's Scholarship Foundation speech arrived with picture-perfect weather. Sarah couldn't stop smiling as she watched her son practice in front of the mirror. He'd grown so much in the past few months, not just taller, but more confident. Ready for your big moment? Ethan asked, straightening Tommy's tie. These days, it felt natural having him there, like he'd always been part of their family. What none of them knew was that another guest had arrived in New York the night before. Robert Jenkins checked into a cheap hotel on the outskirts of the city, reading the newspaper stories about his ex-wife and her billionaire boyfriend with growing anger. Margaret Thompson had told him everything, about Sarah's new job, about Tommy's scholarship, about the money and opportunities that should have been his. 15 years ago, he'd abandoned his sick son and struggling wife. Now he was back to claim what he thought he deserved. The scholarship ceremony was being held in the Thompson Technologies Auditorium. Hundreds of people filled the seats. Hospital staff, business leaders, scholarship recipients, and their families. Sarah sat in the front row between Ethan and Lauren Chen, who had become a close friend. Tommy stepped up to the podium, looking nervous but determined. My story begins with my mom, he started. A woman who worked as a cleaning lady, who read medical books to me when I was sick, who never stopped believing in my dream. That's when Robert Jenkins walked in. Very touching, he called out from the back of the room. "Tell them the rest, son. About how your mother was a thief. About how she ran away and kept you from your father." The room erupted in whispers. Sarah felt her heart stop. "Security!" Ethan stood up, but Sarah grabbed his arm. "No," she said quietly. "It's time to face this." She walked to the podium, standing beside her son. Tommy was shaking with anger, but she squeezed his hand. "Yes, Robert, I took medicine when Tommy was dying and we couldn't afford treatment. Medicine you should have helped pay for, instead of spending our savings on gambling and disappearing when we needed you most." The room fell silent. "You left us," Tommy said, his voice strong. "Mom worked 3 jobs. She cleaned floors all day and studied medical books all night to help me understand my condition. Where were you?" Robert stormed down the aisle. "And now you're living the high life, aren't you? Sleeping your way to the top." That's when Margaret Thompson, of all people, stood up. "Stop," she said clearly. "This has gone too far." Everyone stared as Margaret walked to the podium. She looked older suddenly, tired. "I called you here," she told Robert, "because I thought I was protecting my family. But looking at you, angry, bitter, entitled, I see what I almost became, what I was becoming." She turned to Sarah. "I was wrong about you. You didn't take the easy way up. You worked harder than any of us." Robert wasn't finished. "I want what's mine, my share of her success." "You have no share in this," Ethan said, joining Sarah at the podium. "The only thing you ever gave Sarah was a reason to be strong. The only thing you gave Tommy was an example of what a father shouldn't be." Security finally arrived to escort Robert out. As he was led away, still shouting about his rights, Tommy turned back to the microphone. "As I was saying," he smiled, "my story begins with my mom, a woman who taught me that our past mistakes don't define us. That hard work and kindness matter more than fancy clothes or family connections. That love is more valuable than money." Sarah felt tears rolling down her cheeks as Tommy continued. Ethan held her hand, and surprisingly, Margaret stood on her other side. "I've been foolish," Margaret whispered. "Can you forgive an old woman who was afraid of change?" Sarah looked at her son, standing tall and proud. At Ethan, who loved her exactly as she was. At the hospital staff, who had become her second family. Even at Margaret, finally seeing clearly. "There's nothing to forgive," she said softly. "We're family now." After the ceremony, as people mingled and congratulated Tommy, Ethan led Sarah to the garden terrace. The same garden where she'd once been so afraid to be seen with him in public. "I have a question for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. "One I've been waiting to ask until all the storms passed." Sarah's heart skipped as he got down on one knee. "Sarah Jenkins," he smiled up at her. "My cleaning lady, my savior, my love, will you marry me?" Before she could answer, Tommy's voice came from behind them. "Say yes, Mom. I already approved the ring." Sarah laughed through her tears. "You knew about this?" "He asked my permission weeks ago," Tommy grinned. "Said he needed the approval of the man of the house." Margaret appeared in the doorway, then quietly stepped back, smiling for the first time in years. Sometimes love really did conquer all. Even pride, even prejudice, even the weight of the past. "Yes," Sarah told Ethan, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. "Yes to everything." As Ethan slipped the ring on her finger, cheers erupted from inside. The hospital staff, the scholarship recipients, the board members, everyone was watching and celebrating. "Quite a journey from room 507, Ethan whispered, pulling her close. Sarah looked around at her new life, at her son headed to medical school, her future mother-in-law finally accepting her, her former colleagues now treating her as an equal. But most of all, she looked at the man who had loved her not despite her past, but because of who it had made her. "You know what?" she smiled. "I wouldn't change a single step." Later that night, as stars twinkled over New York City, Sarah stood in her old apartment one last time. Tomorrow she'd move in with Ethan, start planning their wedding, begin their new life together. But tonight, she wanted to remember where it all began. She took out the old library book she'd first read to Ethan in his hospital room. On the dedication page, she wrote, "Sometimes the greatest love stories don't start with a prince charming. Sometimes they start with a cleaning lady, a coma patient, and a heart brave enough to fight for what's right. And sometimes, just sometimes, they end with happily ever after. Because that's what this was. Not an ending, really, but the beginning of something even more beautiful. A story of love that crossed all boundaries, of family formed by choice as much as blood, of second chances and new beginnings. And somewhere in St. Mary's Hospital, Room 507 waited for its next story to begin.